Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel and Happy New Year. Today we are doing a full flip through of my 2023 reading journal. This year was the first time using this size of journal. It is the 8x8 journal from Archer and Olive. I had seen other creators use this in their journals and thought I would give it a try. And while I do like how it looked overall, it was difficult for me to incorporate a lot of my content into this size journal. So if you've seen my 2024 reading journal setup, you will know that I have already gone back to my preferred B5 size. But overall, the 8.8 does work, but again, it was a little too long for me, I think. I think I like the height of a journal rather than it being longer. So that is kind of why I went back to the B5. Anyways, moving on. First, we will start with my title page, including this library card that I made. It is something that I haven't done before, so I thought it would just be a fun and clever way to track the overall progression of my year and track how many books I read each month and then just total it up at the year. So this is basically just a little fun thing that I added to my journal this year, and I did it again for 2024. Moving on to my first spread in my journal, which is my 23 books to read in 2023. I do this challenge every year where I just select books to read throughout the year, and most of the time I'm pretty successful. I can get to a majority of them, but this year I not only decided to read books that I was very interested in and authors that I was interested in, but all of the books that I selected were books that came out in 2023. The only one that I couldn't get to because the publishing date got pushed was War Widow, but everything else came out and I feel pretty good about this. I was able to read 20 out of the 23 books that I selected for this challenge. As you can see, some of them weren't the greatest books, especially those that were conclusions of series like Capture the Sun by Jessie Mahalik and The Blood Gift by Annie Davenport, as well as The Queen's Price by Anne Bishop. I really struggled with those books. I didn't think they were as good as previous installments in the series that I read, but some of my highlights from this challenge were definitely Seanan McGuire's next installment in the Wayward Children series, Lost in the Moment and Found. Series that I started and finished in 2023 was the Drowning Empire series by Andrea Stewart. The Bone Shard War was the third and final book in that trilogy that came out, and that was by far my top series in 2023, so I recommend that as well. And some other notable highlights were Yellowface by RF Kuang, A Shadow Crown by Melissa Blair, which is the second in that series, as well as The Battle Drum by Saara El-Arifi, and then some other top reads for me were the fourth installment of the Lore Olympus series, which I'm just obsessed with, and then a surprise for me because I wasn't familiar with their work yet, but Kingfisher was my top author of 2023, and their book A House with Good Bones was absolutely fantastic. Next up, we have my reading tracker for the year. My goal this year was 150 books, and I think I accomplished my goal in September of this year, so anything after that was just bonus. But again, I just created this little template on Canva and printed it out on sticker paper. That way I didn't have to outline 150 squares in my journal. But once I finished the coloring in of all this, I absolutely love how it looks. I think it looks really great. I have a similar setup for my 2024 journal, and I haven't decided if I'm going to use one color or multiple colors. So if you have any preference, let me know in the comments, and maybe for my 2024 reading tracker, I can shake things up and use a couple different colors. Next up is a new spread that I did this year, and I mostly did it just because I wanted to feature more covers of the books that I planned on reading for the year, just because I like how much I just love how it looks in my journal. So I thought I would track some of my physical TBR books, and these are books that I own and just hadn't gotten around to reading yet. A lot of them were books that had come out the previous year, and so I wanted to read those in 2023. And of the 24 books, I think I was able to get to 18 of them. So I made a nice dent in my physical TBR, so I was quite proud. And I'm actually doing this again in 2024, but I'm expanding upon it. So again, I highly recommend you go check out my 2024 reading journal setup. I have a few more new spreads that I think it will enjoy. Next up is just a spread to help me track releases of books that were coming out throughout the year. I did change this up for 2024 because this I don't think is enough room. There are a lot more books that come out each month, and so I just kind of picked the ones that I was most interested in, but there were a ton of other books that would get released each month that I had to leave off just because I ran out of room, and some of the titles were very long of the books, so they had to be on multiple lines. So for 2023, this spread did work out pretty well, and anything that's highlighted are books that I bought physical copies of. But for 2024, I made this into a multiple page spread, so I think that will work for me a little bit better. And then next is one of my favorite challenges that I do each year, and that's the ABC challenge, or some people call it the A to Z challenge. And this is basically just putting in books that correspond with a letter of the alphabet. I do mine a certain way. I know some are very more stringent on what books they include for certain letters. So like X and Q and Z, there just aren't that many books that start with those letters, but there are some people who do this spread who are very strict and will only read books that start with those letters. But for me, if the letter exists somewhere in the title, then I include it. For Q, if you're a fantasy reader, it's actually quite easy to find some Q books because Queen is in a lot of titles of a lot of fantasy books. So for this year, The Queen's Price fit Q perfectly. But for X and Z, I just used books that had letters in the title. But everything else, I think I was pretty good at finding a corresponding letter. Moving on to my favorite books of each month. A lot of people do a bracket system for this type of things to help them figure out kind of like what's their favorite book of the year. But for me, this challenge is already hard enough because just of the quantity of books that I read each month, it's very hard for me to pick a book to begin with that was my favorite. Some books, I had so many 5-star reads, it was so difficult for me to pick just one book. So I stopped doing the bracket a couple years ago, and now I just highlight my favorite books of each month. But yeah, I think overall, I think 2023 was one of my best reading years. I had so many good books that I read, but even from this list, I had a couple favorites, including The Final Strife, The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi, Her Radiant Curse, Silver. Actually, you know what? I take it back. I loved all of these books. I can't pick a favorite. They are just so good. Even though I did pick a favorite book of the year, that was basically me just picking a book out of a hat amongst my favorites, but I absolutely loved all of these books, so I highly recommend them. Then we have another tracker that I do, and that's just tracking all of the books that we read for my book club. Me and some friends meet every month for book club, and we basically 12 months in advance pick themes for the books that we're going to read. So every month has a different theme of the book that we read. And as you can see, January was wellness, so we read The Finnish Way. February, we wanted kind of an older main character, so we read The Wisteria Society of Lady Scoundrels. And then in July, the book had to have a yellow cover, and then in August the book had to have a one-word title. And so December, the book we're reading right now, even though it's January, the book had to have a desert setting, so we picked Rebel of the Sands. But yeah, this is another favorite spread of mine, just to look through all of the books that my book club has read. We are in our 5th year of our book club, and it's been a great 4 years of book reading. So if you're not in a book club, I highly recommend it. You can even join digital or online book clubs. It's just a fun way to meet people and talk about books. And my final spread of this before we get into my monthly reviews is my Read More Diverse Reading Challenge. This setup was inspired by another YouTuber. So basically, starting at the beginning of 2023, I made a more conscious and intentional effort to diversify the books that I was reading. So I primarily set this up to have 10 books by Black authors, AAPI authors, Latinx Hispanic authors, and Indigenous authors, and then I would just color in a flower for every time I read a book by a BIPOC author. So I was able to accomplish this, and I think of the 220 plus books I read in 2023, 106 of them were by BIPOC authors. So my goal for 2024 is to make that like a 50 plus spread in terms of my book reading for 2024. I want at least 50% or more of the books I read to be by BIPOC authors. So if you haven't set up any reading goals for yourself for 2024 yet, I highly recommend having diversify your reading as one of your goals. It is well worth it, and you could really discover some amazing authors that you haven't read before. Now we're getting into the monthly review portion of my journal. I won't go into too much depth. I'd rather you just go and watch my monthly reading wrap-ups that I do at the end of every month. I go into far more detail about the books that I've read, and I usually highlight my top reads of the month. But if you do have any questions about anything, just go ahead and leave those in the comments. One thing I will say is that I do all my graphs and stat collecting in Storygraph, and then at the end of each month I just plop all those stats into a Canva pie chart and just print them out on sticker paper. So that's what I do every month, but I don't want to go into too many details of my reviews because there are a lot of them. So I'm just going to flip through all of them and each month, and you can kind of see what I was reading and what I was rating. But January was a really great start to the year. I had some really great reads this month, including Heart of the Sun Warrior by Sue Lin Tan. Blood Scion was another great one. And then I started Leigh Bardugo's new series because Hellbent was coming out this year, so I read Ninth House in January, and then Lost in the Moment and Found was Shauna and McGuire's 2023 release for the Wayward Children series, and I absolutely loved it. But I also noticed after January that I was reviewing too many books, so I started in February with only including 8 book reviews per month. And then you'll see back once we get to December that I even had to cut that down because I was just quickly running out of pages. But yeah, so here are my monthly reviews for the first 6 months of the year. So this is a spread that I did after I finished my June wrap-up. I included it in that video, but for some reason put this spread before my June reviews instead of after, so it is a bit confusing. But these are some of my highlights of the first 6 months of the year, just in one little visual spread. But as you can see, a lot of great books on this list. Again, it was so hard for me to pick just 4 of each month, but I think I had a pretty good first half of the year in terms of reading. And just like after the first 6 months of the year, I did another monthly recap of my favorite reads after December and just showcasing all of my favorite books from the last 6 months of the year starting in July. So this is just similar to what I did after June, but as you can see, it's just a nice visual spread that showcases some of the books that were standouts for me in the latter half of the year. And again, like some of these were just so great. I had a great second half of the year as well. And some of these books just made some of my favorites, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but this is just a nice little visualization for all of you to see what some of my highlights were in the second half of 2023. Now, moving on to what I previewed in my last video is my 2023 reading stats. This is the full spreads filled out, and that includes the 221 books that I read, totaling over 72,000 pages, with an average rating of 3.6. For my final demographics of the 221 books, 112 were by Caucasian authors, 48 books featured LGBTQIA representation, 40 books were by AAPI authors, 33 books were by Black or African authors, and then I had 12 books by Middle Eastern or Arab authors, 11 books by Latinx Hispanic authors, and 10 books by Indigenous authors. And then, of course, no surprise, but the majority of my books were in the fantasy genre with 131 books. And then I read 50 books in the romance genre, 49 in young adult, 31 in sci-fi, 28 historical, 20 horror, and 18 mystery. And then down below, you can just see a little graph of how many books I read each month, with March and June being my top months with 21 books each. And now moving on to some of my favorites of the year. My favorite book, I knew I had to pick just one. It was very, very hard, but my favorite book of the year was The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi. It just had everything that I love in a fantasy book or in a book in general, and that's just great storytelling, amazing and lovable characters, and a well-rounded, well-developed plot, and a very lush and intricate world building or magic system. And so it just had everything that I enjoy when it comes to reading. And then my favorite characters were Juliet from Wool and Fatma from A Master of Jinn. My favorite series, as I mentioned before, was the Drowning Empire series by Andrea Stewart, with book 1 being The Bone Shard Daughter. My favorite couple were found in The Final Strife and Silver Under Nightfall. The Final Strife features a sapphic relationship between two characters from different sides in a very hierarchical class system, and the development of their relationship is very sweet and takes place over the course of the book. So it's a bit of a slow burn, and then once it finally happens, I just thought it was fantastically done. And then Silver Under Nightfall does have just an amazing polyamorous relationship, and yeah, I loved every bit of it. And then my favorite audiobook was Nimona. This was very hard because, of course, I listened to a bunch of audiobooks this year, but because Nimona was performed by a full cast, it just made it that much more enjoyable. And then my favorite sequels of the year were The Bone Shard War by Andrea Stewart and Two Twisted Crowns by Rachel Gillig. My favorite author of the year was Andrea Stewart, who did the Drowning Empire series, and T. Kingfisher, who I read 5 books by her. My favorite ending was On Earth as It Is on Television, and I made this my favorite ending because it was the ending that basically bumped this read up from a 2 to 4-star read for me. I wasn't enjoying the book that much, but then the ending just came out of nowhere, and I oh my gosh, I liked it so much. So if you're looking for kind of weird, quirky sci-fi reads, I recommend this one. And then my favorite narrators were Natalie Naudus, who does a lot of books by API authors, including Heart of the Sun Warrior. She was also a narrator in the Drowning Empire series. And then Emily Wu Zeller, who does a lot of books as well. So those two, actually, I think both Natalie and Emily are narrators in the Drowning Empire series. Maybe that's why I liked it so much. But yeah, my favorite narrators were Emily Wu Zeller and Natalie Naudus. moving on to the best tropes, and one of the tropes I mentioned before was found family, but my other favorite trope is animal companion, and To Shape a Dragon's Breath had that in the form of a little dragon. And yeah, I will love any book that has an animal companion. And then my other was the found family trope, and the Free People's Village had an amazing found family in this book, and it was just a great book overall. But the best twist that I read was The Unmaking of June Farrow, and I was reading this because I couldn't put it down and I needed to know what happened. And once that twist came, I made a verbal sound of exasperation, and so I had to apologize to my family for waking them up. But my favorite covers were The Adventures of Amina Al-Sarafi. To be honest, Amina Al-Sarafi could be under almost all of these. Of course, I had the Found Family Best Trope is my favorite cover. It's one of my favorite books. I listened to it on the audiobook, and it was an amazing audiobook. So yeah, I could put this under a lot of favorites, but I only wanted to select it for a couple so I could showcase a couple other books. But Yellowface is also one of my favorite covers, just in its simplicity. It has like such a huge impact, and it's just like a yellow cover with the eyes, and I think it pretty much sums up this book perfectly. And I notice it everywhere I go. I always notice it immediately on the shelves. And again, I love its simplicity, and it's just perfect in my opinion. And then the best ensemble, two of the best ensemble casts were the Water Outlaws, which is another great found family, and then Hellbent. Again, Hellbent I liked so much because it did showcase the supporting characters a bit more, and so I thought that was really well done. And then the best cliffhanger, Ballad of Never After. If you've read this, you know what happens, and so yeah, that cliffhanger just destroyed me. And then the best villain, in my opinion, was One Dark Windows, The Nightmare. Even though they're kind of like not the true villain, but they're made out to be the bad guy, you can't help but love them. And then A Shadow Crown just has like that evil villain character that kind of reminds me of Ramsay Bolton from Game of Thrones. But yeah, so the Shadow Crown, or this series, has a really bad, awful person. So I just picked that as the best villain. And then the biggest surprise, and by biggest surprise I mean just books that kind of just I went in with no expectations, and then my expectations were just blown out of the water by how amazing they were, was A Dowry of Blood and Her Radiant Curse. For me, the funniest book I read was The Past is Red, and then the weirdest book I read was The Salt Grows Heavy. This is a Little Mermaid reimagining, but it's very dark, it's very gory, and very violent. And so, yeah, if you're fans or familiar with The Little Mermaid, where she wants to meet her prince, this one has definitely the prince, but he's not in it anymore, and she had something to do with that. But it's a good little novella. And then the saddest book I read was As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow. Now, moving on, I'm going to preface this section by saying I am not trying to offend anyone. These are just books that were not for me. I gave them all a shot. I read all of them, but there was just something about them that I didn't like. They weren't for me. They didn't have things that I enjoy or that make books enjoyable for me, or they just did things a certain way that turned me off from the book. But if you ended up liking these books, again, nothing personal. These are just my opinions. And you know what? If you like these books, I am really happy that you did. I wish I could have liked them. I went into every single one of these books hoping to love them, but that just wasn't the case. So here are some of my worst books of 2023. And overall, the worst book I read was The Assistant to the Villain. I didn't like anything about this book. I know it was based off of a TikTok series, but I wasn't familiar with it before reading this book. And so when I went into it, I kind of only had the expectations that it was kind of starting to blow up on TikTok, and you'll see kind of the theme in this section. But yeah, when I read it, and I actually listened to it on audiobook, and I was cringing and rolling my eyes the whole time. I don't think the little skits done on TikTok translated into a full novel, and just the dialogue was really bad. The writing was bad. The romance was awful. The premise, it was kind of a good premise, but it just wasn't executed well, in my opinion. And the villain did not villain. Like, most of it was done off page, but this was an awful villain, because he didn't villain, in my opinion. He was just like a nice guy who got made into the villain because he's an enemy of the king. But yeah, it was just a bit too juvenile in terms of the characterizations and the dialogue and some of the actions that the characters were taking. So I will not be continuing with this series, but for those of you who enjoyed it, I am excited for you to see what happens next. And then for me, the worst characters were basically two characters that just existed. Like, they existed, they had no personalities, nothing, and yet we're made to believe that they are heroes and that these dark-haired, gorgeous men love them. And so both of these are fantasy romances, and I liked absolutely nothing about these characters. Again, they had no personality. In terms of redeeming qualities, I don't know, because they were just like wet mops, in my opinion. So, and then when it came to the romances, I had no idea why these men liked these characters, because there was just nothing to them. They just existed on the page. So Dark Knight, Golden Dawn, and the Fae Princes are basically just this entire series. Like, this was the last book in the series, and I read it this year, so that's why I have it listed. But this series, which is like a Peter Pan Why Choose retelling, these are on my list for worst characters, main characters. And then the worst audiobook I read was Fourth Wing. I didn't really like Fourth Wing, and I don't know, maybe it could be because the audiobook was not good. And I heard they redid the audiobook, but I didn't listen to that version, and I'm not going to because it's very long. And again, similar to Assistant to the Villain, I didn't enjoy the dialogue or the characterizations. The world building was very lax. If this was your introduction to romance or fantasy romance, then I think this is a great introduction, but after just some of the other books that I've been reading and seeing how well they're done, this just wasn't up to that. So for Rebecca's first foray into fantasy, it was okay, but because I'm just more familiar with other fantasy, I didn't like it as much. And almost every component that she includes in her book can be found in other fantasy books. So I also didn't think it was anything original. So that's why overall I didn't like the book either, but I didn't want to include Assistant to the Villain in every single category in this, because you really could. So Fourth Wing gets worst audiobook. Worst series, I talked about this, was this series. The third book came out at Kingdom of Venom and Vows, and this had a lot of potential. Starting off, I really liked the first book, but then it just went downhill with every subsequent book. And in this book, all the characters basically did was talk about each other and their love for each other, and basically all agency, everything about them from previous books just went out the door, because all they cared about was them, even though they were in the middle of a war. Forget their people, forget their countries. It's like, no, I want my person. And I'm like, their whole personalities became each other, and I hate it when that happens. So enough ranting. But worst execution for me, and these were books that had such clever and amazing premises, and in my opinion, I just don't think they were executed in the best way. And this could be me nitpicking, and totally okay if you think that, but for Butcher and Blackbird, this is another book that's been growing in popularity on Book Talk, and so I read it in the audiobook version because a lot of people were just raving about it. But I just do not think it was executed. Two serial killers who kill serial killers falling in love. Awesome premise. Like, it's not the serial killing that got me. That doesn't bother me. But when you have this character who is a female serial killer and is supposed to be super badass, but has all these insecurities and doesn't think that she deserves love or can't be loved, it's like, oh my gosh, come on, like, you're this badass serial killer. Can you just have that be your flaw? Like, that is a huge character flaw in someone, that they're a murderer. Like, I don't need you to have all these insecurities as well. Like, yeah, you're a hot, gorgeous, loyal, hot mess. Like, enough of those already. The love interest, he was fine. Like, it was a little bit insta love for me. I think within the first chapter he was already like in love with this girl, but you also didn't see their relationship develop. It all happened off page in these huge time jumps. I think over the course of the book it took 4 or 5 years, and they weren't really together until the 4th year when they finally, confessed their feelings for each other. But yeah, the time jumps, I didn't like those as well. So anyway, yeah, I don't think it was executed as well. And then another one was Starter Villain. This is like this totally like non-threatening nobody notices guy who is like struggling to pay the back taxes on his house, and he ends up inheriting his dead uncle's company, or his estranged uncle's company, that happens to be like a villain company, and so he has to go in and basically become a villain. And the execution just wasn't done right because there was just so much talking and dialogue and just him explaining to people why they're doing things. It's like the villain monologue that you always have at the end of a movie, but instead make it a whole book. I was like, I don't need an entire villain monologue. I just want to see you, villaining. But yeah, so that's why I don't think this book had the execution I was hoping for. And then another category that assistant to the villain snatched up pretty easily, and that was worst writing. I'm sorry, but yeah, it needed a couple more rounds, I think, of editing and work, because again, the writing, like, I have the book, so I was looking through it to see if it was just as bad as the audiobook was making it out to be. And when I was reading through it, I couldn't get through more than a chapter of reading it because I just couldn't take it anymore. But I won't bash on this book anymore. I'm sorry if you liked it. I really am. But for me, the worst sequel was The Blood Gift. Just the main character all of a sudden became so powerful. It was like, okay, well, there's no more stakes anymore. This character can beat anyone, so I don't have to worry about anything happening to anyone. And the plot itself just was super all over the place. Like, there was no good flow to it. Too much going on, and so yeah, I didn't like it as much. It was the conclusion in this duology, so it was a bit of a letdown. And then the worst couple for me was one of the last books I've read of the year, and it was one of my 23 books to read in 2023, but that was Capture the Sun. Each book in this series features basically a different couple, and this book was the last book in the trilogy and featured a couple that were so freaking boring and just, oh my gosh, it was just, I don't know why this couple was chosen. One, because obviously this is a sci-fi romance and it features members of this crew, and this girl who's the main feature of this book isn't even really a part of the crew. Like, she goes off and does her own thing. While you had the actual crew on the spaceship that centers around this trilogy, and instead of featuring the polyamorous relationship that was going on among one of the crew members on the actual ship, you had to focus on this girl who was on some random planet, who's a thief, who hates this guy because he stood her up once. And that was the whole thing. It was just them figuring their dynamic out. While there was all this drama and action going on with the couple and the members of this crew on this spaceship, and I was like, okay, that would have made a much more interesting book. I want to know about them, because this girl is boring. Her insecurities, again, she's a hot, insecure mess, and I'm like, okay, I'm done with this character trope. It's driving me nuts. And the guy, super boring as well, bland. Of course, he fell first, and still love for him, and it took her a while to come around. But yeah, I didn't like anything about this couple or their dynamic or their relationship, and so it just kind of ruined the whole book for me and kind of almost ruined the entire series for me, which is sad. But anyway, enough with that. I feel like this video is already long enough. But my last spread is basically just a full visualization of all of the books that I read, or at least the first 216, because that's all that I could fit on these. But look how pretty it is. All these book covers, just so amazing, so wonderful. But I'm so glad you came here on this journey with me. I hope some of these have inspired you to pick up some of these reads. If you have any questions about any of them, feel free to leave those in the comments. Always happy to discuss books. But yeah, I hope to see you throughout the year. My 2024 journal is already shaping up to be one of my bests. I love it. So if you haven't watched that setup, go check it out. It's a very colorful, very fun setup with a lot more challenges and TBRs that I want to accomplish in 2024. But thank you again for being with me throughout 2023. And as always, happy reading.